if you're talking about this year, what this year has meant in the history of Israel, it might mean the end of Israel. That's what we are addressing. This downfall has first come from within and afterwards from without. So we're dealing with a tragedy. And of course, the right question, both if you study a play or you look at politics, is the question you're putting forward, where did we go wrong?
Hello, and welcome to the Telos-Paul Institute podcast. I'm Gabriel Noah Brahm, director of the Telos-Paul Israel Initiative. My guest today is noted Israeli author, novelist, and literary critic, Orian Morris. Orian, it's great to see you. Welcome to the podcast. You're looking good. Will you introduce yourself to our audience in a little more detail?
First of all, great to be here. Thank you for having me, and I'm glad to partake. More than anything, I'd say I'm a literary critic. That's something I've been doing for the past 15 years, I'd say, in different platforms. I started online on Walla, later moved to Makor Rishon, the right-wing intellectual paper of Israel, and finally had, I don't know, like a stint in Haaretz probably for a few years as a literary critic, and now I'm back to Makor Rishon. So in that sense, left and right both work for me. I do my job. That's to do maybe with politics. Literature for me is always first and foremost. In Israel, of course, you can't really take the two apart. Israeli literature does deal with the ideas of Israeli nationality, which we'll probably be talking about soon, and has been that way always because, as Frederick Jameson says, Israel, in a way, is still in the allegorical stage of its art and literature, and that's why usually Israeli art does deal with the situation, so-called.
Hamatzav, for the Hebrew listening audience, Hamatzav, the situation.
Yeah.
Well, great. So we have much to cover in a relatively short space of time. You know, our topic is this very painful one of possibly the worst year in Israeli history, some people are saying. And I want to ask you how things look from your perspective, looking at Israel last summer during the protests against judicial reform, leading up to October 7, and its aftermath right up to the present. What connects these sort of key moments? Is there a connection between the proposed judicial reforms and the protests and our lack of preparedness on the horrible day? People disagree about these things, and we want to know what you say. Orian, how can you describe the reforms, what was going on with the reforms and the protests? And
yeah, you're asking a big question, like quite a complex one, and it's a question of narrative. So, my sense of it is that there is an actual truth to it, and I will try to touch upon it. I'd say the above. First of all, apologetically, as an Israeli, I must first divulge it. I'm not in Israel at the moment. I am now in India, Manali. So in that sense, I'm not part of these people who are now bearing the cross of the situation, though I have spent enough of my life there to kind of understand, and I'm doing my daily reading and listening to see what's going on. So the past few months I've been here, which might even help me to grasp some of it being out of it. Okay, now to the thing itself, the great question, what's the connection between the protests and this devastation of the 7th of October, because I have no other word for it. It's like on my part, this is the Israeli experience of a day of Holocaust. Are you there? Okay, I thought the connection went down. Okay, so that's the feeling I had through the first 2-3 days of that event, that we are actually getting to experience as Israelis what it might have felt to be a Jew during the exterminations of Jews in Europe, like people, locking themselves in, escaping on like with their bare skin, skin of their teeth, etc. Okay, so that's just to describe the day itself. As to what led to it, I think it's a malicious narrative, really. Like I have no other words like this. It's not only false, it has malice in it, it has intent in it, and therefore malicious. To say that Hamas or Iran or our enemies at large succeeded in that day because of the protests. That's my feeling. The protests actually was a movement to save Israel from downfall. It was heading towards a catastrophe in the internal sense, at least. It was basically like attacking itself, which has been the case, the Israeli right, and specifically the Israeli right throughout the year of 2023. Like all the ministers were busy taking apart the ministries they were supposed to head. Ben-Gvir was busy with that, doing that to the police. Of course, Yariv Levin, you were talking about reform. Reform is not the right word for it. It's not a judiciary reform. It's actually an attempt to take over the judiciary wing of the state and being able to both manipulate it and control it, especially on the behalf of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is standing on trial. And that's why he let Ben-Gvir, supposedly the Minister of Justice, head this reform, because otherwise he would not be allowed to being indicted with criminal, what do you call it? Criminal, like he has an indictment of bribe and all sorts of mischief, governmental mischief,
You're talking about Netanyahu or Ben-Gvir? Netanyahu.
Yeah, I'm talking. Yeah, Netanyahu is always like when you're talking about the Israeli right, since Rabin's assassination, Netanyahu is always the key figure. He's the one who shows them the way. Like supposedly Yigal Amir is the assassin. Supposedly Yariv Levin is the one heading this. It's like a move towards fundamentalism. It's not reform. The citizen had nothing to gain by this supposed reform. The politicians had everything to gain by this reform. And that's why you can't call it a reform. Reform is supposed to be a movement forwards, a progress. And this is not the case. Though they say that part of it is letting different groups, minorities partake in the judiciary process, all this is nonsense. There have always been different people standing there and sitting there on the high court, etc. It's not the case. It's not about their identities, their colors. It's much more than that. It's about how you allow judiciary process to take place, how the state is under criticism of the high court, etc. The more the high court is involved, the less tyranny is possible. And that's why you see it in every country when they try to weaken the Supreme Courts, they're trying to take over the instruments of government. Basically, it paves the way towards tyranny of some sort. Okay, it could be like an idiocracy. It could be I don't know. Like a theocracy. This kind of paved the way towards a theocracy in Israel, like this reform. Yeah.
A theocracy. The reform could have been paving the way to a theocracy, to a greiter role of religion in government. Okay, so that's part of what was at stake in your view. Well, it's interesting. Some people thought that reforms were necessary, of some kind.
Reform is always necessary. You can always make the case. In any organization, you can always make it the case, especially if it's been going on. This organization that was put together 70 odd years ago. I'm sure it needs change. The question is, to what goes, in what way do you go about it? All these people were even quoted before that. I mean, Rothman, Levin, they were haters of the high court in Israel. So if you give the reforms to these guys, you will know what to expect. And that's why Netanyahu put it in their hands. He knew what he was doing in that sense. And what were the only laws to be passed in the reform? First was the law that doesn't give the Knesset the right to oust Netanyahu while he's in government. So that did pass, oddly. Like the rest was blocked, but that did pass. Why? Because that was the first and only thing that mattered to him when this reform just started. So it's important to know what we're talking about when we're talking about judiciary reform. In Israel, it was like considered to be like in the left-wing, it's like more than half the populace considered to be basically like some kind of putsch. Yeah. A putsch of the extreme right who took government by some kind of weird chance and tried to form the state in their character. That's about how we said. So if we go back to the role of the protests were about one thing, Israeli security. Now, say what? First of all, there was data coming, like the last bit of it was coming from the Ministry of Security in Egypt. Who was saying that the Hamas were about to do something big. They don't know what, because it's like basically being, orchestrated by Iran and not by Egypt, obviously. But they knew that the Hamas was about to do something big, and they informed the Israeli government and security services. Yair Lapid, the head of the opposition, knew of it at the time as well, and that's why it came out 2 weeks before the 7th of October, stating that this reform is actually killing Israel and might be a real security threat, worse than any that our enemies pose to us at the moment. Okay, so the protesters said, hang on. Before you're changing the country, you must know that there is a contract, an ongoing contract between the Israeli citizens and the nation and the state. We give 3 years of our lives, as I did, and then we serve for 20 years as reserves, but we do that knowing we are soldiers of a democracy. Yeah? Not a theocracy, not an idiocracy, and not a corrupt state. We're willing to sacrifice the time, we're willing to put our bodies to this test as long as this is the contract. If you want to change it, we might not be willing to do this anymore. So this is actually a great question for the whole nation. Like, what's the new contract? What is it about? Because Netanyahu and Levin said nothing of judiciary reform as they were campaigning in 2023 for this new government. They said nothing about it. It was not mentioned. Everybody knew they had they had their case against the high courts. Yes, that was kind of an ongoing propaganda against the Israeli judiciary. But no one knew what it meant really, like what kind of reform they were about to do, if at all. It was considered to be just propaganda. But once they started, this idea of changing the contract meant like the world to the people who are giving their lives in service of the country. So they said, before you do anything, this must go through the people. This must go through maybe a democratic vote. There are many different means to test an idea like that before you go about it and see if there is, I'm not even talking about the consensus, but some kind of agreement that, would lead that process. Since they had none, they just went about it full force. And it became a clash between the Israeli Zionist centrist left and this extreme right government. So actually, as I perceive it, the protest was about saving the country and saving the country from its government before a catastrophe happens. And that's what we were saying all along. And I'm saying we, not because I'm like an activist. I did go to some of the demonstrations. For sure, the night Netanyahu attempted to fire Yoav Gallant, his own security minister, like the only guy with a clear mind there who knows what he's doing, because the rest is not amateurs. They're non-professionals. In any way you test it and go about it. Like, none of them has served in the army. Like, Ben Gvir has not a day in Israeli army, nothing about the police except being indicted in various charges. So the same goes for Smotrich. All these people, they know nothing about running a country. And Netanyahu, all this time, is He's under like an ongoing criminal process, like where he's being indicted. So all these people, like, they don't care so much about the country, and they don't know so much about its security. That's for sure. So I see it the other way completely. The whole idea of the protest was to try and stop this, because this was just tearing the army apart, and it was posing a real security threat. And that's how it evolved into the 7th of October. It's true that the army wasn't ready. That's another case. Also has a lot to do with the only character who was key in the last 15 years. That's Benjamin Netanyahu. He's the one who led the wrong reception, but we can talk about that. That's another thing. This is only about the process, the protests. Yeah.
Great. We will get into the conception or the conceptia in a moment. The understanding which Israel had about how to deal with Hamas and Gaza, and also Hezbollah and Iran, the conception that things were manageable, but we'll get to that. On this question that's so painful and important that you raised, so movingly from your perspective as a ex-soldier, still a reservist, I guess, at your age, and
no longer. I was let go at the age of 38. Like I did my 17 years of service, and they had like enough people said you can go. I tried to volunteer the day after the 7th of October. They told me we're full, no guns, no rifles, no helmets. So I tried twice and said it seems you're too old, so I bought a ticket to India.
Well, Kol Hakavod, you tried to enlist. It's a pity for the nation that you weren't accepted and
killed in action.
Orian, this question about the posture of folks like yourselves, experienced military reservists, who were, as a part of the protest, indicating their reluctance to show up for their so-called voluntary duties, but it's so routine, it's really part of the system. And as you mentioned it, you, like others in your position, felt that this was very necessary for the emergency situation, as you describe it, as you understood it. But the question is, do you understand, correct me if I'm wrong, that there are those in Israel? How would you address those in Israel who have a hard time forgiving the impression that was put out that our army wasn't maybe so ready or even dedicated fully to protecting us, and they think that this could have been one factor in Hamas attacking?
Okay, I need to answer this right away, because it's two separate things. The question of readiness, which is the job of the army and its chiefs, is one thing that has nothing to do with the question of the process, of the protests. Sorry. That's an ongoing thing. It takes years to prepare for a war that you're expecting, or an incursion, or so you go about that as the job, like the main job of the army is its preparedness for war. That's one thing, and has nothing to do with these tumultuous months of judiciary fundamentalism which was going on. Okay? The other thing, these people who are volunteers, which you can say like, you can put it like in a parenthesis or out of parenthesis, like, because it's not, like, first of all, I'm not there because I wasn't one of the reservists. So this was not my claim that I'm not going to show up because no one was expecting me anyway. That was never a key figure. But there are key figures who would show up weekly to their service in different army units, getting paid not like substantial money for it, like they could get much more outside the, Israeli security and army businesses. And they do that job because it was part of their lives. And they realized they must raise like a black flag and say, this is too much. This is a real danger for our organization, which is, it recruits people as part of a contract again. And they say, this is like breaking the contract. Now, if you want to try and see why there's nothing to forgive, the people who are asking us to apologize, supposedly, are the people who never served in the army in the first place. It's like Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and their following. These people have nothing to do with the guarding of Israel, with the maintaining of the army. They have nothing. Like the extreme right who has this narrative that there was either a betrayal or a spontaneous, harmful act in this protest, mostly have nothing to do with this great project of Israel trying to survive and protect itself in a hostile environment. The people of the protest mostly are the people who serve. Yeah. So it's the other way around. The people who should beg for forgiveness are the people who picked on this very section of the society, on like Israeli institutionalized sector, who was either serving, I don't know, as bureaucrats or as army key people, and they're the people who felt that threatened and intimidated by this judiciary so-called reform. So they have nothing to apologize for. I repeat, nothing. These are people who gave their lives. Unlike the people who hold the other narrative, like Yair Netanyahu, the son of Benjamin Netanyahu, who was now spending the time in Miami and has been there, I don't know, since the 7th of October, I'd say. So these are the people who are busy claiming that, they find it hard to forgive the protests. Like, what's their contribution? That's my question. Yeah.
It's very interesting when you speak about people like yourself who served with distinction, who gave generously, who didn't get paid a lot of money, and who did it for long periods of their life, many of whom moved up into, I think you called it the bureaucracy, the maybe high-tech sector.
Yeah.
An important sector of Israeli society, a talented sector, a courageous sector that gives a lot to the country, soldiers and so on. Is it what some people call the deep state or the professional managerial class, to name this sector? Something like that?
Yeah. Deep state is not the right phrase. Like, it's been like reinvented to fit the Israeli right here. Deep state is not basically Israel is suffering as a young state. It's suffering from growing pains. It has a few different divides that are very painful within Israeli society. The clearest way to view this is looking at Yigal Amir, the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin, Israeli prime minister, who headed the Oslo process, viewing his ethnic, religious identity, and looking and juxtaposing it with Rabin himself, one being secular, the other being religious, one being Ashkenazi, the other being Sephardic, one being a left-winger, liberal, as far as you can call someone who's, who's been like in the army most of his life, a liberal, yeah. But oddly enough, in Israel, the army is the liberal bit with Israeli institutions as we have it now. That's how far right it's gone. And Yigal Amir being a right-winger, devout, thinking theocratically that giving any piece of Israel entire is, is wrong, not only politically, but is like going against God. This is like heresy. In that way, a bit similar to the way the Ayatollahs of Iran are viewing, the world, like heretics and followers, and etc. So this is like the key divide. All these ethnic divides, which basically form like one half of the country and the other half. Now, I don't know, like no one has the right way. No one's holding like the only truth of the matter. But you could say that the Rabin figure in that ethnic group maybe formed Israeli institutions in many ways according to their perceptions of what is governance, what is justice, etc. So you could talk about like a low level of representation for the other group. Yeah, like they feel they had nothing to do with the processes that put together the state, and their feelings and their attitudes don't have enough representation, which for sure was the case until the 1980s, for sure. Like, you can't argue about that. Israel had an Ashkenazi secular hegemon that was running the state. And it was that way not because they took over, but because they founded the state and they founded the institutions of the state according to their perceptions, of what is a liberal democracy and what is the Jewish state and what is the Jewish way of statehood. So it only happened that way because they were there, not because they were running this deep state. The others were not there at the time in the same ratio. Okay, so there was some kind of upheaval or change in the late 70s and early 80s, where other groups were coming into government, and they were also going about, in some ways, first of making it a vibrant democracy in the way of having other people, have their voices heard and their identities manifested in Israeli governance. And basically, if you look now at the Knesset, you'll see that there are more of the other side. I must confess, as an Ashkenazi secular liberal, supposedly, I am of the other side, yes? If we're talking about this judiciary reform, for instance, yeah? Which supposedly was coming from there, only not to their behalf. That's the idea, okay? So Israel has been changing, and Netanyahu was the key figure of the extremist part of this change. Anyway, this has been going on from 95 until 2023, for sure. You can check it, like just looking at the Knesset members and how the different parties are growing or shrinking. Shas, of course, is important in that way, like being both Sephardic and ultra-Orthodox. And it's like a key party in Israeli politics. And wherever they go, basically, that's where Israeli politics go. Because they were also part of the Israeli Oslo Accords, which could not have taken place without their agreement and taking part in the Israeli coalition. So the key moment, it's sad to admit, before 2023 is 1995, like the Rabin assassination, and Netanyahu coming into power. So we can talk about that, like what's the connection between these 2 years in two acts? One is called a reform and the other is an assassination. I think both are, you can put them together as an assassination of the previous Zionist Israeli state. That's like an ongoing process. And it's found its like climax in the 2023 judiciary reform, so-called. And of course, it's found its demise in the 7th of October. It's catastrophe.
Okay, well, this is a fascinating narrative. You're reminding us that in 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by Yigal Amir. That had an impact on what you referred to as the Oslo years, the Oslo peace process. I want to ask you about that, and you've indicated a connection, connecting that to 2023, so we should flesh that out. Let's just put a pin in that for a minute. We also have to get to the conceptia, which is another stage of our narrative.
So let's do that first.
Let me ask one last devil's advocate question on the reforms. One final one before we move on. There are those who say that Israel isn't a democracy, really. It's a juristocracy, because I only want you to comment on this. It's an interview. It's not a debate. It's believed that the Supreme Court in Israel has more power than there's Supreme Courts anywhere else, and that Supreme Court Justice Aaron Barak constructed a kind of power for himself and his fellow Supreme Court justices, unlike any in the world, and that this is simply
Okay.
not democratic. So we cover this and then we move on.
Because you mentioned his name, I want to ask, who is Aaron Barak? What does he want? He is a pensioner of the Israeli Justice Ministry, the High Court. He is not after any power. I wouldn't even say that he has any, known to the people, any political approach to dealing with the Arabs. Like, he's just a bureaucrat who found that it could be beneficial for the Israeli state and its citizens, first and foremost, to be able to approach the judiciary process whenever they feel that the government is being malevolent or tyrannical in any way. So I said, why not open the gates? Now, this is like an ideal that every country would want to have, every democracy that holds critiquing the government and even blocking it when possible as a good thing for its people, So that's like a liberal notion that in most countries has not evolved to the state that Aaron Barak helped the Israeli Supreme Court come to. That's one thing, which is nice. The other thing, which is not so nice, is that it's ridiculous to blame the Israeli Supreme Court of running the government since all along the way, throughout what is called the occupation, of Judea and Samaria and Gaza. The Supreme Court would allow and concede to every demand of the army and the Israeli government in the running of these territories. I'm trying to say that not only are they cooperative and not bossing the government, they're actually quite servile. One good thing that Aaron Barak did to do with the occupation is he also allowed these occupants, as in the Palestinian people, also a way to approach the Israeli judiciary system, which is again is a good thing to prevent tyranny, even for the people where, we've taken the land, basically. So Aaron Barak is nobody. He is a nobody in Israeli governance, and he's not a key figure. He's just someone who actually reformed the judiciary system in a way that would help. It's also not the case that every Israeli is now knocking on the doors because of this reform. But he helped simple people like yourself and myself, and even simpler than ourselves, if you want to have it that way, approach the Israeli judiciary system. That's all. The Likud party, as in the leading right-wing party of the Knesset, has always made it their business in their propaganda to blame the court for every mischievous failure they were having. Like, why did we not defeat the Hamas in 2014? Because of the Supreme Court. Now, there's no connection whatsoever. This is like a Goebbelsian, as in Goebbels, the Nazi, way of going about propaganda. Like finding someone who has nothing to do with it and saying he's to fault. Like, that's why we failed at it. They're stopping us, which was never the case. I repeat, throughout the occupation, the court was servile to the government and to the army. So you cannot blame them for anything to do with Israeli failures of security and of defense, etc. That's not the case. It's made up of Zionists, mainstream, center-field, and I consider Barak to be that as well. I need Aaron Barak. He's also center-field. He's like, there's nothing about him that is different than most of the Israeli populace. The only thing is he's a bit whitish. You can say that, but that's to do with complexion.
Yes, Ashkenormativity is not all bad, you're saying. You mentioned...
Yeah, he's like a guy who grew up poor in some, bleak neighborhood of Jerusalem. Nothing special, nothing uncommon about the guy.
Okay, just two follow-ups on this, and then we really do move on. As to what Barak's responsible for, it's complicated, but one thing that I think even a casual listener can understand, correct me if I'm wrong, did he not introduce the standard of reasonableness by which the court can decide if a law that's passed constitutionally by the elected government, it's constitutional, it's passed, but the judiciary in Israel can decide if it's reasonable or not. You're a learned man, you're a philosopher, you're a great reader of literature. Doesn't this create a kind of Platonic form of government where we are saying these people are more reasonable than the rest of us? And is that a proper form of democracy?
No. Basically, these people represent us. They're not different. It's not some elitist strata, aliens, lizards who've been put in these high court uniforms and are running the state behind the scenes. These are just like common people. One is married to a Likud member, another whatever, one was Arab, and there are a few ladies there. They're just people. And it's true, mostly Ashkenazi, because they've been in the judiciary system for some time. And again, to do with chronology, it was easier at the time, or you had more Ashkenazis in government, so that's why it's mostly Ashkenazi. Okay. And like any liberal, I'd be happy for that to change and to have it like completely whatever, representative. If skin color is what makes representation, okay? Whatever. But going back to the reasonability clause, yeah? Okay, so first, like I'm not an expert of law, probably neither are you, but the right wing has put itself, I'm not being like argumentative. I'm saying, as reasonable people, we can comment about.
Yeah, okay, so particularly in a Jewish state, which is not exactly a reasonable thing to begin with. Zionism wasn't reasonable, but it works.
Okay, so you've given the reason why this was put in place. Because in some ways, and especially now, you cannot put your whole trust in the democratic process as is manifested in elections. Yeah, because we had Mayor Kahana, who we consider in the 80s. Again, this old Israel, considered them to be like a fascist, like the prototype of a Jewish Israeli fascist. Not that he's really an Israeli, but he came over and that's that. So we realized that it could go that way also. Israel could go that way. And actually really... it has. I know you're in America.
Olim are not real Israelis. Go on.
No.
Immigrants.
He's not a real Israeli in the sense that he's not gone through the Israeli experience before going into the Knesset. What was his experience? Like attacking Arabs? That's his case, and that's his claim to fame. Okay. So basically, he's the prototype of Israeli fascism. And since that was always like a certain particle or a danger or a threat to the Israeli democracy, as is, the Jewish experience in Germany in the 1930s, and things could go that way. Democracies can collapse into theocracies, fascisms, etc. So they realize, like government has to be critiqued as well, has to be not blocked, but has to have some side to reach some kind of balance with the Israeli bureaucracy. Okay, so they basically put these things in so that in case of a collapse of the sort that we're experiencing now, the judiciary or the Israeli Supreme Court could have a say as well. Yeah, and in some cases even block or annul a certain law that's being passed. Usually it comes back to the Knesset for rephrasing. Yeah, that's it's been used twice, and now we're coming to the important part. Again, I'm no law expert, but basically this clause has never been used. It was put there so that if things go wrong, they could be stopped. Okay, it's been used twice in like the lowliest of the cases, and so you could not just could, you should argue that it was put in place not to be used, but to be made just to make sure that things don't go exceptionally wrong. Okay, since then things have gone exceptionally wrong, so we should be actually again thankful for Aharon Barak if it's his law, which I'm not sure it is at all. Like, I don't know that he put it in place, but it's to do with his term in office for sure. But we should be thankful that he put in Israeli government such a law that could obstruct things going wrong. Okay, I'm putting it like since then, so much has gone wrong in Israeli government. It's like the worst people have put in the most, like sensitive jobs. And the only figure, I return to that, like, what was it? We call it in Israel the gallant night. Okay? Lay gallant, the gallant night, which is the night Benjamin Netanyahu decided to oust Gallant from office, because Gallant said, if we annul this law, if we go about exterminating this clause, this would tear Israel apart and tear the Israeli army apart. And as the boss of the Israeli army, being the
Minister of Defense,
Security,
just so everyone hears.
Yeah, the Minister of Defense. So he said, I'm not willing to be part of this. Like, this will really damage Israeli security. Netanyahu deemed he could fire him that night, and then just the crowds went to the streets and showed him that he can't. Basically, what the crowds were doing were putting in place this law of reasonability, saying it's our reasonability that's at point here. It's not about Yoav Gallant at all. It's not about security or the Minister of Security. It's about reasonability being part of Israeli government's part of the rights of the Israeli crowds and populace. So Netanyahu backed down, as he always does, when enough people go to the streets. That's what he's actually best at, like with tactical retreats. And that's why his government is holding so long. He's like retreating and retreating and retreating, and it has now gone into the Israeli geography, because we have retreated since from both, the Gaza envelope, if you like, and the Israeli north. These are also tactical retreats under Netanyahu. So basically, it's the same idea in different aspects of governance going forward, and causing just the extinction or demolition of the Israeli state. And this is what we're dealing with, like this past year that you're trying to touch upon. This is like at least my feelings.
Yeah, we want to map the last year in view of a broader spectrum of history that you're intimately familiar with. You're a keen observer of Israeli political and cultural life for many years. So you very helpfully linked our present moment back to the Oslo period of the 90s, to the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin in 1995. And we need to connect the dots from there to some other things, like we mentioned now a couple of times the understanding or the conception of the conceptia that was the ruling, governing kind of mindset in Israel that left us a bit. But
these are two things I think which should be taken apart. Like what happened in Oslo and its downfall or demise, like the way this failed, and the conceptia is another thing that has to do with the past 10 years of the Netanyahu regime. So there are like a few dots on the way. So I'd say, since we're talking about the present, let's talk about the conceptia first and leave the best bit for last, okay? Okay. About the conceptia, the conception. And what is the conception? Basically, it is the above. And I heard also your discussion with Gadi Taub, and he phrased it perfectly. The idea that the Hamas is deterred and is not willing to confront Israel, at least not at the time, and not in the near future as well, because it's getting so much money, like, again, bribed by the same, advocates of bribes in the Israeli government, was allowing money to flow in cash in suitcases from Qatar to the Hamas regime in Gaza. And this was a Benjamin Netanyahu classical move. You have a problem, there is some kind of solution, like there's some cash flowing from one place to another. Why not connect the dots and let it go through you and put you in a better place? Like, it's in Israeli interest that Hamas would get the money, and we're basically buying peace, buying days of peace, because we know they're all about jihad, so it's not real peace, but we're buying days of peaceful management in Gaza. Why not were we asked whether we should, like, going about bribing Hamas is a good move? I'd say it wasn't a good move. I'd ask you a simple question. If someone was harassing you and your family daily, and you found like some kind of guy who's willing to put in the cash, saying, you know, I'm gonna just pay him off so he doesn't harass you, would that be the right move? It would.
Did you want to remove Hamas from government in Gaza?
Hang on. I'm just saying, I'm now talking about morals, yeah? Like, is bribing someone to not harass you a good move? This is like on the personal level. Like, would you wanna like deal with the mafia in that way? Because there are a lot like the mafia, and so is the Israeli government. These are mafia moves, mobster moves. So I would say no, it's not right. Israel, hang on. You posed the question, so I wanna address it. So if you'd ask me, and you'd ask most law-abiding Israeli citizens whether they want to partake in a bribe of giving money to the Hamas for nothing, you know, for not attacking you, supposedly, would you go about that? I'd say no, I wouldn't want that. But we were never asked.
You didn't have elections? You have elections 5 times a year.
Did he ever put that on the table? Did you ever say, like, I'm busy? No. This is informal knowledge. No, everybody knew it, but this is informal knowledge. Like many of his offenses, it's informal. He never said, yes, I'm moving cash to buy days of peace. Do you consider that to be good management? He never put it to the Israeli people. He never put it to the test. He just went about it. Now, as bribes go, this was a good one, you know? It actually succeeded for some years, yeah? But again, you're dealing with mobsters. So it was until they had enough cash, and then they said, you know, fuck it. What do we care about these suitcases? Our goal is jihad. Our goal is not the cash suitcases. And that's where Netanyahu did not notice a difference between himself, a cash-loving man, and the Hamas governing of Gaza, which is not their business. They're about jihad. This is the conception. And he's the father of the conception because he was the mover of the cash suitcases to Gaza. Basically, he was doing something illegitimate, like giving money to terrorists, to your own enemies, sworn enemies, which state like every week that they want to destroy you. So you give them money as not to go about it. That's an idiotic, horrendous approach to governments. And this is what Netanyahu has been doing for the past years. And it's true that he's not being stopped. Why is he not being stopped? Because the Israeli judiciary and Supreme Court has not been strong enough throughout these years, because he has weakened them systematically, both the army and the internal security and the Supreme Court, to the point that they're not dealing with everything they must deal with. This is how this came about. And this is how the concept, because every guy, and you must listen to this, because being out of Israel through these years, it's very hard to get. Like the way this concept sunk into the lower levels, the lower echelons. All these people were used to the ways in which Netanyahu runs the state and manages the conflict. And it looked like a success for many years. It seemed to be, you know, going about successfully. Only the wrong thing was bribing your enemy, this mafia state and this terrorist organization. That's where the concept started. And all the people who've come in late to these key positions, and they could only acquiesce. Otherwise, they would never be appointed. This is what happens in tyrannies.
So, with this in mind, where can we go next? I'm afraid I keep
We can go to Oslo because it's an interesting analogy, what you said.
Yeah, because again, let me just, for the audience's sake, just briefly.
Yeah.
It's an interesting analogy, I think, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, because we're talking about how we got to this very dangerous situation. Now, we lost so many lives. We have hostages in Gaza. We have the north with Hezbollah, where we've lost territory. We have 80,000 displaced internal refugees. We may have a terrible war with Hezbollah with rockets that can hit Tel Aviv. We're at war with Iran. We're at war on 7 fronts, basically, if you can count them all up, the Houthis and everything else. Oslo, the Oslo period, and then the withdrawal from Gaza. There was a period we're not going to get into all the details for an audience that's maybe not
No.
specializing in this, but what we're really talking about is something everyone can understand, the idea of two states. Oslo was the time we believed in two states. Following that, there was a withdrawal from Gaza at a certain point as well, that we thought we can't stay there. And on up until at least 2009, there was a robust discussion of two states. Now, I want the audience to understand this. You won't disagree with me. There is no constituency for two states in Israel today. None. And so, wasn't the mistake, if we want to play the blame game, which I don't believe in, and I know you don't believe in it, we're not finger pointing for the sake of it. We're trying to understand what's going on. And you have a fascinating viewpoint of it that's really informed by all kinds of experience that I don't have access to, and years of study and of following things. So I'm very glad we can present that to our audience. Was not Oslo, the two-state process itself, in effect, the turning point where we got this terrorist government set up in
I get the question. Basically, we're asking, where did we go wrong? Where did it go wrong? Where did we go wrong? One thing I want to stress, like, we're dealing now with a tragedy, an ongoing tragedy, not in the sense that I want you to put on a serious face, but in the sense that we're talking about the downfall of Israel. Like, if you're talking about this year, what this year has meant in the history of Israel, it might mean the end of Israel. That's what we are addressing. This downfall has first come from within and afterwards from without, at least to my perception, yeah? But it's strangely enough, or poetically enough, it has become like the two have become one. The fall of Israel from within to this group that's now the ruling class, yeah, this government, and then the falling to the hands of our enemies, because Israel is now, the whole state is captured. It's not just the people who've been abducted and are held in Gaza. The whole country is being held by Gaza, Hezbollah, Iran, and in a way, it's held captive in a way that the West is not able to negotiate the way out. Like, it's not clear how to go out of this predicament. So we're dealing with the tragedy. And of course, the right question, both if you study play or you look at politics, is the question you're putting forward, where did we go wrong? And next to it, in parentheses, is, and what about the two-state solution? Could that have been the right way to go, which would have prevented this tragedy? Let the question hover over our head for like one moment. Yeah? Where did it start? Where did we go wrong? And was the two-state solution ever the way to get out of this predicament? Okay, so I want to address it like one by one. First, the two-state solution. Unfortunately, this two-state solution, as regarding what came after 1967, like, if you consider that to be the two-state, like Palestinians in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, this could never have evolved into the peace accord in a two-state solution that would work. Why? Geographically. Do you know of any other country that's made up of two minute territories that has one governance and that is able to, enjoy independence and prosperity? I don't know of any country that's made up that way. That's one thing, especially not that was founded in that way, like having one strip here and two pieces there. So that's not a way geographically to go about the founding of a new state. So this, never made any sense, and it's not our fault and it's not their fault. It's the way the history went. And it's true. Why? And when you ask, why did the history go that way? Arab rejectionism of any form of Israeli nation or of Jewish nationality in Israel was never accepted. And that's why Israel could have only come by way of war. because it was never recognized, never accepted in this territory. And by way of war, this is the map that came out of the conflict. And this map spells out no Palestinian state. Okay. It doesn't matter who's at fault. It doesn't matter who's to blame. It doesn't matter whose responsibility it is. But this two-state solution could never have worked. Unfortunately, maybe the Belgium and the Swiss and the Dutch could have managed could have managed a state of that sort, but not here. Not under Islam that believes that Israel is theirs. They have the prophetic right from Muhammad, and they have the responsibility. They have the obligation for jihad. Yeah, it's necessitated that Jews and heretics would not control these lands. So, in these two cultures, this could never have been accomplished in the past. And I'm not saying that maybe in a sort of future, some kind of confederacy would evolve from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, through Jordan, through Israel, through the Palestinian territories, and that could be managed. This is like a future we all aspire for, like being a nation, like a peace-loving nation, you know? And okay. But
except that Israelis don't want it after October 7th for good reason. Israelis feel unsafe.
I'm saying that forget October 7th and forget what anyone wants. What's feasible and what's not. So the two-state solution always had the problem that there was something not feasible about it, and that did not really accommodate the needs of the Palestinians. They should never have accepted it. Like on their behalf. Like if I were a Palestinian, I would say no to this offer because it's not a good offer. As being a native to this land, as they see themselves are, I'd say no, I'm sorry, like you're coming into my house, you took over the living room, the best bedrooms, and now you're offering me like two different wings in the worst places of this apartment. No, this is mine to begin with, so I'm not accepting the offer. And I could see their point. Okay. The Islamist culture is another particle, like the way they view Zionism, Judaism, etc. That's part of it, and that's part of the rejectionism that we're facing with, but it doesn't mean it will always be the same. So you could say that the way the West viewed the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was always wrong. They never got it right. To the extent that the two-state solution could be managed under, the lines of the actual map since 1967. What you could do, and probably must do, if you want to reach a resolution, is go back to 1948 and go back to the deep questions of whose land it is. If you have two people of the same size, like a few millions, of Israelis and Palestinians, now, again, interestingly enough, you could say that there are 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians in Israel entire, including Gaza and everything. So it's basically balanced. We have to rethink all the questions of how both people get to satisfy their basic claims, where they get equal rights to the land. Now, this is super problematic, but I'm saying that's where you have to begin. So it doesn't mean there will never be two states, but it has to be rethought. And in that way, only in that way, I would say that there is something that pushes forward from the 7th of October is the rethinking of borders. We cannot have them being stranded in Gaza and say, why don't you manage a proper government? Because it's not proper that they're in Gaza in the first place. This is just the effects and the results of war. So that's one thing. Just to do with the philosophy of the two-state solution, where there's something wrong to begin with. I don't really believe that neither Biden nor the Supreme Court, who has no role in this at all, really buys into the two-state solution as is posed. what they do want, and this is true both for the Supreme Court and for the Biden administration, they want Israel to remain a legitimate state that acts in accordance with international law. They don't want it to become a leprous state that's only known for its occupation and its control over another nation. Now, these things are very hard to put together because on one hand, you can't give them the state they don't want. I'm talking about the Palestinians. And on the other, you don't want to become like a criminal and have a day-to-day occupation in which you force yourself on them. So it's very tricky. And Biden has to have this position, both for his constituency, who in a simplistic way do not want to support an oppression in an oppressive state. And, I can see that. Why, as an American or as someone from the outside, I would not want to support a state that's busy, manipulating and controlling and investigating the citizens of another state. Like they have their rights. Okay. But because there is no solution, especially not this simple one of the two states that's the results of the 1967 war, is locked into the position of the two-state position, and he must be there, and he must say that because he wants Israel to be a legitimate state. That's my first point. I don't believe anyone in the American administration really buys into the two states as is now posed on the table. Another comment that's really worth addressing, you were talking about giving them a gift of a state, like
a reward.
They butchered us and we're going to give them a state.
Look, the world started recognizing them. Europeans are giving them a gift already. The Europeans declared their recognition, blah, blah.
In one way, they're right. Because what the 7th of October does show us is we need to rethink everything. Borders also. And there is a need to address Palestinian needs. There is a need to address Palestinians' claim for a nation or whatever. Hamas by now realizes that even if it achieved that, it would not benefit from it, as in it would not be the government that would be put in place if Palestine would be recognized by the world. Somehow they, in their crazy way, they sacrifice themselves in order to promote a Palestine that would not be Hamas-led. And I think they kind of recognize it by now. That's why they're having talks with Fatah in China, like thinking about how to shift governments of Palestine. This is something we don't know much about. The future will tell. But I don't think it's a gift we're handing the Palestinians when we try and give them the rights, their basic right to nationhood. And unfortunately, it took the 7th of October to shake the Netanyahu regime in such a way that it would have to rethink its control and management of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. No, you cannot make them vanish politically. They're there. 7 million of them, if you also count Israeli-Palestinian citizens, Israeli Arab citizens. I'm not trying to say anything about their identity. I'm trying to tell you that, yes, there are 7 million people of this identity, and this has to be realized that they have equal rights because they have equal part in this Israel entire. No one knows how to go about it. Really, like no one knows the frame in which you go about dealing with the nationhood for both peoples now. Especially after the 7th of October, like everyone realizes a need to rethink. No one knows what's the right frame. Okay, so that's one thing. Like another thing is talking about the previous frame of mind, which is the 90s. 1993 is the year of the signing of the Oslo Accords. But basically, I would argue the above, saying Rabin, after many years in serving in the army, being chief of staff, being minister of defense, like his profession was dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict day to day. After 50 years, he said, okay, Israel is paying too high a toll for this crisis. for this managing of another people. We'd like to open Israel to the world in a way that's previously could not occur. We have to find a way to reach some kind of diplomatic accord and process, because it was an ongoing process, the Oslo Accords. That's why they say accords. It's not a one thing or a one-time deal. It was an ongoing process, which was supposed to peak or to climax in a two-state solution. But it was never signed as such, only in the hope of this development. Okay? So Rabin was no sucker in the way that he didn't think that if he promotes the Palestinian Authority, it means that they'll acquiesce to the two-state ideal of the Israeli left. He knew that it was much more tricky, but he also realized that if you put a processing in progress, things evolve. While doing that, as long as the army chiefs have talks, as long as people cross the borders between the different nations, which actually, one of the reasons why this horrendous atrocity happened in Gaza, in the Gaza envelope, as in the West Negev, is because the people stopped crossing borders. And they could think of Zionism as a monster and Israelis as monsters, which helped them massacre and butcher babies and elderly people and rape Israeli women, because they no longer met with them. They knew nothing of what Israel is like.
They were working in the orchards. They were working in the kibbutzim with the peaceniks.
A tiny minority. The whole of Gaza, as in the 2.3 million, just stopped being in touch with Israelis, and it's true for both ways. That's why it's so bad not to be in a peace process. So what Rabin actually tried to go about is getting the process started and see what will happen, because it's way better than the 7th of October. And I mean both internationally, diplomatically for Israel, like what we're seeing now, and internally between the two peoples themselves. That's why he went about it. Not because he was naive, not because he was stupid, Netanyahu is a genius, yeah? Because he was a man who knew this conflict so well that he knew that it has to move someplace. It cannot just be, stagnant, because it's super dangerous. He wanted progress, and he understood that some kind of peace process was the way to go. It doesn't mean that he thought we'll find, like, the end game here is this two-nation, two-state solution. It doesn't mean that he thought we'll get there, but he thought it's better to be on the way than to block this. But not letting it happen is much worse. And in that way, I think he was historically right. And the Israel we know now that's enjoying, success in the international markets is the Israel of Yitzhak Rabin, in that case. Another thing that should be stated is it's not that the Oslo Accords failed, is that he was assassinated. And he was the Oslo Accords. He's the one, he didn't initiate it, but he signed it. Yeah. There was violence throughout the process, which is, like crazy. Like, you go about putting together a peace process, supposedly, and at the same time, they're shooting people on the roads who are driving from Israel to the settlements and basically terrorizing you while you're going on with this process and giving them guns to control and police their own people, which you're not willing to do in some ways. Yeah. So of course there was this. It's not even a paradox. It's like something a Western mind cannot really understand. Like, what's going on? Is this what they want? And we will never be able to answer whether Arafat was glad for it, or just could not control it, or could not control himself in policing different factions. Who knows? Nobody knows. But it certainly posed like serious questions to the Israeli government, to the Israeli army. Like, who are these people we're dealing with? What do they really want? It wasn't clear. But as long as you had the process, it seemed like a price that's worth it. Because at least you know you have like good intentions that are leading you somewhere. And it might go wrong. So you then have to apply some force and stop that, which is what happened in the second Intifada. Finally, Israel said, okay, no, okay, no more. This is like the deal is gone. It's over. And then they took over the Palestinian territories again, like Gaza and some of the West Bank as well. Like took control of the cities because it proved unmanageable. But there's something missing here. The European process was never not only finalized, it actually did not even come into fruition because he was assassinated. I'd say by the Israeli Iraq, not just by Gabriel. That's my attitude. And for me, it's important to say that although you could never argue that in court, I do think the violence instigated by Israeli politicians, first and foremost Benjamin Netanyahu, is what allowed this assassination to occur. But
if someone's listening, they might wonder, are there a lot of people who think the way you do, Orian Morris, in Israel? I'm not saying it's the truth is democratic. You could be right and you could be alone, or there could be many like you in Israel. Can you sociologically say what percentage of Israelis have this take on things? Are you relatively a lone voice in the desert, or do you have a lot of colleagues with you?
Sorry, I didn't get like all of it.
Are you alone in these thoughts, or
are you?
Are there a lot of people who think the way you do? Where would you situate them on the political map, and how significant are they in Israel? The people who think the way you do, or is it one man's perspective? I mean, how extraordinary is the picture you're painting?
That's very hard to say, in the sense that when Rabin was prime minister, it seemed that most of the Israeli public, you couldn't say you couldn't put a number to it, but basically had a coalition, which means that he has most of the Knesset, most of the representatives with him, and he had also the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox movement, which was always tending towards the Dove position and not like the hawkish position. So he had like most of Israel with him. That's talking politically, and it seemed that as the Oslo Accords were proceeding, more and more people were leaning towards this idea that trying to reach a two-state solution would be better if it's feasible. So you could argue that in 95, most of Israel, that was always basically of the same demography, had a different attitude. Now you could say that the same Israel, like the demography has not changed that much, although there is always like a demographic threat internally of Orthodox, taking over or whatever, because it's not really happening. Israeli secular society and Israeli liberal sector is also in this boom of childbirth and so on. So it's the same Israel, I would argue, and as far right as it is gone, it is the same people in the same sectors.
Okay, so there was a majority in Israel for Oslo at the time. Everyone should know this. That's clear. That's clear. Israelis supported two states. That's clear. Today, I just want to ask you, and then we move on. I'm just curious if the listeners can get a sense of, is this a common kind of viewpoint that's somewhat shared among a sector of Israeli society, or as they say, some people say there is no Israeli left, but it sounds like
no, I don't believe like all this is like
I'm asking you to clarify.
I'm trying to answer. I'm trying to talk. First of all, I don't know the people. It's millions, yeah. They have gone through a government that's trying to make them stupid. Just turn on Israeli TV and you will see what I'm talking about. This is true for most theocracies, fascistic regimes. They try to make the people not as intelligent as they could be, because it's easier to manipulate and control, and that's clear. So this has been an ongoing process, but still they have not made the Israelis, dumb enough in the way that I think they could always shift again. I don't believe that Israel has become a right-wing nation. I don't believe that at all. It's the same people as they were before, and the way they shifted from left to right, they can shift again. And they will, by the way. Like, this is what's coming. And all the polls are already showing that, like, for the next elections. The only question is whether Netanyahu and his regime will allow these elections to take place. That's like the big fear. Because obviously they have failed, they need to be put for elections. Like, the public has to have his say now after this huge, enormous failure. It doesn't seem that he's willing to do that. He's not willing to have an inquiry into the events of the 7th of October, because he knows what the results would show, that he was in charge, he's responsible, he's the concept, he's the failure, he must go. So he's now trying to stop time, which is quite impossible, just like he tried with the Palestinians. He tried to stop time, stop progress, stop generation, and it won't work. And it will erupt the same way if you apply the same means. So this will happen. Like, Israel will shift to the left. The other thing is the question of international support, or the way the international community observes Israel. That's like really dire. I have no other word for that. Very concerning and dire. Because you think that if a nation was hit the same way Israel was hit, it would find support in liberal minds. But that's a mistake.
Why? Elaborate,
Minds
because before Israel responded, we're getting now to anti-Semitism in the US. I want your comments on this.
It has
we're
nothing
shifting
to do with the Israeli
topics
response.
now. We're
nothing to do.
So
Israel was weak, and the wolves just came out of these liberal sections of the West.
Why was there so little sympathy?
Because they're not liberal.
Before Israel even responded, Americans were screaming against Israel after this vicious assault. Just help me with your understanding of this.
But actually, it seems like a mystery, but it's actually quite simple. Yeah. As long as Israel could manage its situation, there were no places for these calls, like for Israel to acquiesce to free Palestine, as if Palestine was Tibet. You would hear nothing of that, because Israel was there. What happened is that Hamas shook the foundations of Israel and opened up the question, and all the demons came into play in the West. The West liberal mind is not really liberal. It doesn't even get, I think, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because their liberal minds are not, don't have the aptitude to grasp the unliberal minds of jihadists, Hamas, Iran. They don't even know what they're about. They're not Tibetans. They're not Buddhists. But they perceive them to be Tibetan Buddhists when they say free Palestine, just like they said before, free Tibet. So that's what the Western liberal mind is like. So what they sniffed is weakness coming out of Israel. And this happened due to the Hamas taking over the borders and basically shaking the institutions and the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And in that way, the Hamas succeeded enormously. And that's a huge failure. That's why the borders should never have been manned like they were. Yeah, that's why the concept is like the key to this huge failure. Really, it can't be described. And that's why this regime has to go. Its days are over. This failure, you can blame the Supreme Court, you can blame the court. It doesn't change anything. The failure is of enormous proportions, international proportions. It's as big as the UN vote for the recognition of the state as Israel. That's how big this failure is, and that's why the results are negative accordingly. It's the exact opposite. Basically, Israel is not recognized as a legitimate state anymore in the liberal West, or would be recognized only if there is a Palestine next to it, which no one knows where it will be, like what kind of Palestine. So this is like the worst outcome of the negligence and corruption of this regime that we've been part of for the past 15 years. 7th of October basically showed us, not just Benjamin Netanyahu, who's to blame for it, but us as a nation, let him govern it, let Netanyahu govern us, that we know nothing of the future, we know nothing of this region, we know nothing of how to go about managing this conflict. Basically, it proved an enormous ignorance on our part in every way possible, both internally, how to go about governing the state and running it, talking about the judicial reform, and also outwardly, like with the Palestinians, how to go about bribing them or appeasing them or whatever. We really know nothing about how to run the state of Israel. And in that sense, we know nothing about the future. So I'm saying we're in a very special moment in that way, that we can let go of not just the concept, but so many of our prior conceptions. Say, okay, we're now going on a new path, a new road. All axioms have to be left aside. Like the Palestinians are rejectionists and will always be that way. Who knows? Who knows? Nobody knows what's the true identity either of Israel or of Palestine, if there will be such a state. And in that way, we're like afforded a new kind of hope of letting go of the past. And I really think that there will come to be new leadership in Israel, and probably that I can't say with enough, confidence, because I don't know the Palestinians. But probably also on their part, they need like some kind of new voice or a new attitude, because this one is not proven to be so good in governing Gaza, as it's sacrificing its own people, which the liberal West is not willing to concede. But this is what's going on. And Sinwar himself, leader of Hamas, has said as much. He said, I'm willing to sacrifice 100,000 of them. I don't care. He said that. That's not me saying. He said that prior to the 7th of October, and that's what he's doing. He represents the way Israel is hateful for the Palestinians. And in that way, they're willing to pay prices that we can't imagine in our Western minds. Like they're willing for sacrifices that for us would seem criminal, and we see that every day now in Gaza, unfortunately. So, okay, with this mind, there's very little we can do. But this mind is so destructive that I'm sure this will not be the face of Palestinian governance in days to come. Like they're going to have probably a new attitude. It's not just different persons. It's a different way of observing the goals of a nation. And they should be a nation because they are a nation. We made them like deteriorate internally as well and disperse. And they've lost their sense of nationhood and selfhood in that way for sure. And that's tragic on their part. But they're about to regain it, probably. And like the Western world with its legitimizing the idea of Palestine is going to help them achieve that, probably. So something's got to give. And in that way, what's coming is change. I know nothing in the way this change is going to introduce itself to us, both in personas and in attitudes. But there will be change in personas and attitudes. And that's blessed, I suppose. And it's not messianic. It's like a necessity on both peoples. Like we need that and they need that. Really, like in terms of survival. So that's my optimistic view of the future. And the only thing I kind of, I hold that like as the kind of blessing is that this explosion and implosion is gonna like shed our old skin from us, and we're gonna like develop a new one, and change is gonna come. That's it. And we're ignorant of it. It's also very important to state that really nobody in Israel knows what's gonna happen now. And I would say the same for Palestine.